Recently, Valve released a video showing Counter-Strike's movement in comparison to CSGO. This is absolutely major for a couple different reasons, but before we get into that, let's look at the actual footage, which I will pause at different points. Now, while it looks like it's not exact, it's pretty darn close, which is an amazing feat considering these are on two different engines. Now, how is it possible to make the movements so similar on both engines? Well, I think they created a script to do this, which means that the strafing inputs should be the exact same amount of time, which means that any visual differences we see are differences in the actual movement. But while it's not exactly the same as CSGO, it should feel nearly identical. After all, look at how small the deviation really is. Even at its largest point, it's barely anything. Now, the next thing we should take a look at is the build number and date. This is from a build on June 19th. This is footage from the build on June 9th.
My sound effects.
Nice. Where's the pistol?
Market. Last one on B.
Now you can see that the acceleration and deceleration do appear to be slower on this previous build. Even though at this point I was already complaining that after the last movement changes it was starting to feel too much like CSGO. Keep in mind, I'm an old legacy CS player from Counter-Strike 1.6 and Source, so I like the older movement schemes. But still at this point we had gotten no word officially from Valve if they were going to decide to go with the CS2 movement scheme or revert to a legacy style. And this is because in the earliest builds of the game, the movement actually felt somewhere in between. I even spoke about this in a previous video before all of the movement changes. Movement remains fairly similar to CSGO. Well, at least it's still closer to CSGO than it is to legacy Counter-Strike, but the acceleration does seem to have been slightly slowed. The best way to explain it is it kind of feels like you have a little extra weight on your character. And I feel like this is a really good compromise for legacy Counter-Strike players as well as Valorant players. So I could definitely see Valve sticking with this movement scheme. And personally, I hope they do because I really hate that AD-AD spam. Now, while I was personally loving this new movement system because it allowed me to relive my glory days back in Counter-Strike Source, a few outspoken CSGO pros didn't feel the same way. And while usually this doesn't mean much, in this case, Valve seemed threatened enough by it to release a statement. Preserving CSGO movement skill continues to be a focus in Counter-Strike 2. Here's a video showing jiggle peeking and counter-strafing in CSGO compared to the latest build of CS2. Meanwhile, back when Counter-Strike Global Offensive came out, we had the entire global community from Counter-Strike 1.6 and Counter-Strike Source screaming against the movement. Here is an official ESEA video that came out trying to get the movement changed to feel like 1.6 and Source. Keep in mind, ESEA was the biggest league in America at the time.
So the changes to these mechanics justify the need for adjusted movement model. Regarding the issues with this movement model, people found ways to exploit it. We've seen it with the AD-AD, and we've seen it with people peeking in and out of cover while pre-firing. And you can't really do anything about it because of how wallbanging and tagging are implemented in the game. So it's just more effective to also keep moving and peeking.
As things are now, it's less effective to hold angles and play passively than it is to be aggressive. And this goes against what we define as being Counter-Strike. We have to remember, Counter-Strike is a tactical shooter, not a fast-paced shooter. With our slight adjustments, you will still be able to shoulder peek, however not exploit it. Holding angles will be more viable. Also, tagging will seem increased. However, we want to point out that tagging has not been touched. It is only the acceleration that has been changed.
But of course, this plead to make Counter-Strike a more tactical shooter like the previous incarnations fell on deaf ears. Valve never once responded to it, and the reason why is CSGO wasn't really meant to be just a straight-up competitive shooter. It was meant to be a console shooter also.
Did you know that CSGO was never actually meant to be a PC game? After the release of CS Source though, devs began working on CSGO, originally a console port of CS Source to get the game on PlayStation and Xbox.
So the reason that the movement was changed in the first place for CSGO is because on a controller it's incredibly hard to counter-strafe, especially with the much slower acceleration and deceleration values that CS Source 1.6 used. But Counter-Strike was in a really tough spot anyways, and that's because the Counter-Strike community was split into 1.6 players and Counter-Strike Source players, which means that either game had very few tournaments and very low prize pots. So to save the game, we made an agreement that we would all switch over to CSGO despite it being inferior. But despite this, the game did not seem to be picking up any traction. And the reason for this was the movement. This did not feel like Counter-Strike was supposed to, so legacy players didn't want to play it, and new players were struggling to join. This is also why ESEA proposed the new movement values. But that's when Valve introduced skins. You'll see that the numbers bounced between about 50,000 and about 20,000 for multiple months until skins were finally released in August. Then the player numbers went right through the roof. Not because of the new movement, but because of the skins. Still though, regardless of the type of movement, give people enough time, they'll become accustomed to it, and they don't want to change. The same thing happened to us old school legacy players, and to this day, you ask any legacy player which game had better movement, they'll probably say either 1.6 or Source. So I guess the question is, was Valve able to successfully change the movement over in CS2 to emulate Counter-Strike Global Offensive? Well, the test build that they showed us was on 6.19, and the update that came out was on 6.20, and did have some movement fixes. Now, sadly, the notes aren't very specific. It doesn't say, updated the movement to feel like CSGO, but I jumped in to test it. The acceleration is absolutely insane. So yes, it feels just like CSGO, with two exceptions, and those are lateral movements. For example, ducking, crouching around. You can crouch, but it's a lot slower. And sometimes it just feels slower than other times. Maybe it's a bug. And the second is jumping. Jumping feels heavier, or at least that's how other YouTubers describe it.
Change with, well, at least jumping and crouching. It still feels the same, a bit sluggish, and, you know, like it's got problems keeping up.
It does feel different, and it does feel like you have more of an impact when you land. And if that wasn't evidence enough, you can definitely tell in the headshot percentages. Yeah, I have to borrow other people's accounts because I wasn't blessed with a limited beta. Anyways, guys, I hope you guys enjoy another 10 years of this movement. I'm personally very disappointed, as I've been waiting for a massive movement change ever since the release of CSGO. I guess I'll just have to wait for CS3 to come out. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and as always, have a great day.